morning from Western North Dakota, men and women in blue, coming at you off the cuff. Telling my voice compared to some of the previous ones we've had. Pretty excited this morning. Be in house here with a real special guest. We'll get an intro to here shortly. But morning, Chief.
Morning. How are you?
Good. You're just saying this is more like weather. We should be out in the bird country.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to seeing that blaze orange and pumpkin spice. And this is one of my favorite times of year. You know, football season, hunting season, blaze orange, pumpkin spice. I'm ready.
I agree. I think it's great timing on this episode number 4 that we're at right now. We got a lot of good things happening, obviously, with the school coming up, and I think we're going to be doing something with the school related podcast here soon. I think that's the intent, not?
Correct. We're going to get Sergeant Stocky, who's in charge of our school resource officer program here in the public schools, on board for a future podcast, and I believe that's going to be our next episode.
Yeah. The fall upon us. We got a lot of good stuff happening in the building, a lot of stuff running around. We got some quarterly training. This morning we must have had nearly 30 officers, it felt like, running around here getting trained up. I say that like that because that's going to be a big thing we're going to be talking about today with our special guest. The other part of the timeliness, I feel like, is we're coming up on 9/11, and we got a 20-year anniversary of 9/11 upon us, and so I hope we can kind of talk about that a little bit. Do you remember? I was a young pup then, Chief. 9/11. What were you doing?
I was when this started to unfold on news. I was feeding a toddler in a high chair baby cereal, and I remember watching it unfold. And it's I think everybody remembers where they were that day and what they were doing. It's just something that's embedded in everybody's mind, and I'll never forget that. And I ended up working the 3 to 11 shift that evening. Coming into work, it was just a very solemn, different attitude, and nobody knew what direction our country was going to go at that time.
Yeah. We don't have much time with the man this morning, but a special guest for the day, Congressman Armstrong. How are you doing?
Great. It's great to be back. I think it was fun when we walked in. It's kind of like you said. It's kind of like the Stark County
courthouse in 2006. Get to see you. Get to see Mike talking about Sergeant Stocky. These are some of my best times was busting your guys' chops in a courtroom once in a while.
Do you ever think back and being only 44 years old, still being a young man, and when somebody says Congressman Armstrong, U.S. House of Representatives, what is that? How does that come across, or what do you think when people say that?
Well, first, like when it's you all, I'd tell you to call me Kelly. I try and tell everybody to call me Kelly, but no, it's really, it's the best job I ever had was coaching the Dickinson Rough Riders American Legion baseball team. The highest privilege I've ever had is to represent the whole state of North Dakota in Congress. We're very unique. We're one of very few states that only has one representative, and I mean, you guys have known me for a long time. I love this place. I love Southwest North Dakota. I've spent my whole life here. Don't ever plan on really leaving. Had to move 100 miles east to Bismarck. I'm 8 minutes from the airport instead of 100 miles with a time change, and I care deeply about all my constituents, but I have a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old constituent, and it saves me about 50 nights a year at home, but it still depresses me every time I drive east out of Dickinson.
Yeah, I think the history of it, for those that are listening that don't know the full bio on Kelly, is obviously the hometown stuff, which will be weaved in throughout the conversation. But I mean, criminal defense attorney against everybody here in the room at some particular time. He also represented some of us in the room at certain times throughout different instances, and a public servant himself in currently what you're doing. But of course, volunteer fireman for years, right?
7 years. That was one of the worst part about I always tell people I've been really blessed in life. The single biggest, I think, sacrifice I've personally had to make when I got involved in politics was having to resign from the volunteer fire department. Oh. It's not a job you do to just put on, like your resume or whatever to say you do it. When you can't show up, particularly with alert crew and how things work, somebody else has to cover for you. So when I first got involved in the state Senate, when I represented North Dakota, I tried to stay on, and I don't know if I was a really good fireman when I was trying it full time, but I know by the time I got elected to the state senate, I turned into a pretty bad and unreliable fireman just because of how the schedule worked. So I had resigned from that. And I miss those guys. You know, we did the Bakken barbecue, and no offense to you all, but I hung out with Dusty and Mark Selly and those guys over at their booth, and I just miss being a part of that. That's the one thing that I really, really enjoyed doing that I don't get to do anymore.
Yeah, they got a good culture. They're a very tight group.
Who placed higher in that Bakken barbecue? Do you remember, Ken?
Oh, hey, you know what? We should ask. I think the guy didn't he reveal the awards or the placing?
None of you took first.
I think we finished ahead of the fire department, though, if I remember right.
That is true. That's true. September 11th, Kelly, you know, can maybe take a little more. Where were you at on September 11th?
Yeah, so you were talking about that. I was walking into the law school library at University of North Dakota with my brother was standing right next to me, and we both just left, and we lived in a duplex. Him and his wife had one side, and me and my other brother and a couple of my buddies had the other side, and we just went home and sat on the couch and watched all day long. And so when it first came on, it was the one tower, and everybody's like, what the hell happened? And then when the second tower got hit, it was like everybody knew what happened. It was right. And so it was a shock to the system. Continued going through all of that. One of the coolest things I've got to do in Congress was meet with George W. Bush at the George W. Bush Presidential Library, and a small group of members went down there, and we're down there, and this will be a September 11th story. So, and I don't know if you all know how Congress works, but everything is basically based on seniority. So there's 9 members of Congress, and they go down, and we all get to ask the president a question and all of this. And as is with most things with members of Congress, about half of them didn't ask a question. They wanted to tell him how important they were or whatever. So it gets to the end of it, and I only have one question. I'm like, I want to know from the time you got to Yankee Stadium until you threw out the first pitch, what it was like. Because, and George W. Bush gave this great speech about how by that time in your political career, you're not nervous when you go to rallies, you're not nervous when you give speeches, you've done 1,000 of them. But the reason I bring that up is when he threw out the first pitch, old baseball guy, that was like the first time I felt like things were going to be okay again. Like that's the second memory that is etched into my brain, is when he threw out the first pitch at the World Series in Yankee Stadium. It was like the first time I felt like we're going to get back to where we were.
Sure. I think for me, you know, following that, you just remember, you know, all the flags. You saw all the hand holding and, you know, the unity and different things that took place for quite some time. It seemed like, you know, after that. But and today, certainly, there's a little bit of a different feel that's kind of taking place around. And
I got to believe you got members here who probably joined up National Guard or something. I mean, very closely after that. People who were on the department here, and I mean, I served with members who joined within a week after 9/11.
I kind of put Chief on the spot a little bit, but from the National Guard standpoint, Chief, do you know how many do we have right now that are?
You know, we had several members of our department that served active duty, you know, following 9/11, and several National Guard members in our department that currently serve. I think we're probably right around, 2 to 4 members that are currently serving in the National Guard. You know, one thing that followed 9/11 was such a strong sense of patriotism, and it seemed like we really had God and country in our lives at that point in time. What are your thoughts, Congressman, as far as trying to bring that sentiment back to us? It seems like we have deviated so far away from that.
Yeah, so we get that question a lot. It's like, and when you go around, people be like, well, this has to be the most divisive time in the history of Congress. And my response is, I don't think it probably is. I think when half the country was trying to leave the other half of the country, that was probably the most divisive time in Congress, most divisive time in the country. I think the deal right now is there's just so many different ways to communicate with people. And I speak to a lot of senior classes and junior classes in high school, and I don't talk partisan politics. When I got invited to talk about impeachment, that got a little difficult. Sure. But what I talk about is public service. And, you know, we all grew up with the golden rule, do unto others as you've had done unto you. And I think the new golden rule is if you wouldn't say it to somebody's face, you shouldn't say it with your thumbs. I think the way we have the ability to communicate is fantastic. I mean, the technology that we have allows us to do this, what we're doing here. Allows us to communicate with people we would have never been able to stay in touch with even when we grew up. But also it allows us, when you have that buffer of not being face-to-face or in the same room with somebody, you see the civil discourse go down. And I always tell them, I'm like, listen, if you want to criticize, I'm in partisan politics. That's what being a member of Congress is. But we're starting to see it bleed over into our county commission meetings, our school board meetings, our city commission meetings. And we do not want any people making decisions in D.C. any more than absolutely possible for Western North Dakota. That's just the truth. And it doesn't matter if it's me or a Democrat from New Jersey or a Republican from Idaho. But the only way that works, and if local control works, is if we get good people to run for local positions. And we have the most accessible government in the history of the world right here in North Dakota. And so if you have a problem with somebody on the park board, call them. They're volunteer positions. You know, last election cycle in Dickinson, we had competitive races at the city commission, on the park board, all the way across. And it was the first time in a very long time that I struggled with who to vote for. Right? When I grew up, it was usually unopposed elections. So one of the ways we can do it is just be nicer, fight about ideas, quit criticizing people.
You think we have a little bit of the benefit here in North Dakota with our small populace and maybe more of a tightness in some of these other areas that you're seeing and you have relationships with?
I do, but I think over the history of a lot of this stuff, we are starting to see it's becoming more and more reasonable, and it's becoming more and more acceptable to be a complete jerk about things. And I don't like that. I've never liked that. I mean, I can be an incredible jerk if I have to, but I don't like myself when I do it. I also think the other thing when you're talking about patriotism is I was in the 7th grade when the Berlin Wall fell. That's the first thing I remember. 9/11's the second one, but I was in the 7th grade history class watching it on one of those old box wheel-in carts that we used to have at Hagen Junior High. And so if you are younger than me, which a lot of members of Congress are, you don't ever have what we grew up with, like the real difference between democracy and communism, democracy and socialism, right? So we grew up with that with Ronald Reagan. I mean, there are a lot of Republicans that are here because of Ronald Reagan and involved in politics. So if you are the generation younger than I am, you didn't grow up with really understanding the binary difference and why communism is bad, why socialism is bad, why the United States is the greatest country in the history of the world. And so if you only learn about it intellectually and not live growing up with it and having those conversations, I think you run into a lot of that. I mean, most of the people in the military right now weren't even born during 9/11. I mean, we are generations away from these things that brought us together.
At the top here, as part of this podcast mission, it's, centered around public safety, criminal justice, right? Obviously. And, let's talk some of the topics across the country that are being had here. What are some things that you are being a part of right now? And I know we've talked in the past, some of the use of force stuff and different things that are there. But could you maybe give a rundown to our listeners on,
Sure.
National police reform and maybe how those things could relate to what they need to be paying attention to here in the city of Dickinson?
Well, I think what you always need to be able to pay attention to in Dickinson is when they're trying to deal with inner city policing issues, whether it's Minneapolis or Detroit or somewhere else, those policies, if passed at the national level, will become unfunded mandates, and they don't work in rural populations. I approach this the same way I approached it when I was in the state legislature. Whatever we do on police reform or whatever we do on public safety policy, one should be local, because law enforcement is inherently local function. Chief, you're hired by the city commission.
Correct.
We elect a sheriff. We elect our state's attorneys. We elect our judges. Why is some Democrat from New Jersey or Republican in Idaho going to tell us how to do police reform here? But more importantly, it has to work at 2 a.m. on the side of the road. That's when it has to work. We ask way too much of cops all over the country. We ask them to be social workers. We ask them to be mental health professionals. We ask them to be tech wizards. Not everybody's Sergeant Hannell. We're talking about whether it's body cameras or dash cameras and all of these different issues. We have to make sure that we allow law enforcement to go home to their family every night and protect and serve our communities. That doesn't mean there isn't places for reform. I worked real hard on reform in North Dakota, and I'll continue to work hard on reform. Qualified immunity is the one that everybody talks about. Well, the problem with qualified immunity is, particularly in rural communities, it's not going to necessarily be borne by the officers. It's going to be borne by the communities, right? And every excessive force case is a civil rights violation. And every civil rights case is fact-based. So these are what I explained. So if you are trying to hire a Golden Valley deputy, right, or a cop in Dickinson, and we're having trouble recruiting. We've had recruiting problems since the oil boom started, probably before that. You're going to offer to pay, you're going to cover the insurance as a community. That's the only way you're going to fill your police department. Well, you're going to see a whole sue and settle industry exist from one end of the country to the other. And if you're in a small community, you'll settle the first case. You might even settle the second case, but then your insurance premiums are going to go up to the point where you can't afford to have a law enforcement, a local small, one of those 6-7 department police forces, which means then it gets turned over to the county and you have all kinds of different issues. There's just no way to do this nationally. Think of how you do training. If you require strict timelines in how you do training with high turnover departments, think the Dickinson Police Department in 2013. Yeah. It's not only that you were understaffed, but your years of service on any given patrol was really low because the rest of the country was in a recession. We're hiring people a lot from Minnesota, but also they're getting poached by other departments. They're going to work for security in the oil industry. And if you have to get those guys trained up in an unreasonable amount of time, you could be sending like a third of your department to training, and we might not be offering that training in North Dakota, so they may be going to DC or somewhere else to do it. Well, how does that increase public safety?
Qualified immunity, that seems to be on the bipartisan level. That's the big barrier in the road on some of the policies and this legislation going through.
I think if qualified immunity wasn't in the bill, I think you would see, Senator Tim Scott, Senator Cory Booker, Karen Bass, Pete Stauber. I think they'd have a deal already. But it's one of those things where if you get 99% there and you don't solve the qualified immunity problem, you don't have a deal. And listen, I've thought about this. As you said, I've represented officers in officer-involved shootings, and I think I probably have more of a real-world knowledge base about this than just about anybody in D.C., and I've thought about it a lot, and I know what I conceptually would want it to look like, but I can't get it on paper. It's a really difficult thing to happen. Now, and remember, qualified immunity is judge-made law. It really is. And there are some real cases where I think every reasonable person would look at it and go, this is not what this was intended to do. But trying to reform it in a way that works. So listen, the one thing you do when you get out of the car every single time to go on a traffic stop or anywhere else, you don't take your family's future with you. You take your own safety. Only people in law enforcement every time they get out of the car are walking into danger. It's obviously the vast majority of them aren't dangerous, but you don't know that. There's no such thing as a routine traffic stop until it's over. It's not routine when it starts. It's routine when it's over. But the one thing every member of your department and every cop from one end of the country to the other knows is that when they get out, no matter what happens, they're not taking their family's future with them. And that's what happens if you get rid of qualified immunity without replacing it.
I think, as part of it, when you're looking at, those issues and why qualified immunity gets raised, you can tie some root causes back into the quality of the people that we have, obviously, that we're hiring. And I always think it's interesting that if you draw up an avatar of your perfect officer and you put Lieutenant Hanel's IT brain in there and you put Chief Dossinger's experience, administrative experience, leadership, and then if you put, my caveman size into this whole deal, and then you try to put a price tag on that, what's the price tag? The price tag isn't the median income probably of $47,000 to find these perfect people, right?
No, and nobody does this. And if you're working shift work, it's hard for your spouse to have a job. You're missing baseball games. These things are all difficult. But I also think we have to remember, particularly in places that are trying to hire people, we all know departments that have hired somebody that probably they shouldn't have hired. And that's where we can help, with some kind of national database on unadjudicated actions. That was one of the things they fought. They wanted every single claim of excessive force to go into this database. Well, I practiced criminal law for 10 years. I'd say about a third of my clients probably claimed excessive force, and about 99.9% of them were full of it. That's just the truth. But if you have a department that's 6 or 7 people down, that's not just 6 or 7 empty seats. There's 3 or 4 guys at least that are currently working there that are hitting overtime by noon on Thursday that are thinking of leaving, right? So there's reasons why they try and fill seats, and sometimes they do it even with people that they may take a chance on. And it's not just to fill the empty one, it's to make sure they don't have more out-migration, because then you run into a real cycle where you cannot get shifts and experience and all of that, because officers have a really tough job. They have a lot harder job when the department is when the department isn't full and really suffering from recruitment, because then they're all working even more than they're used to.
Oh, I was just down at Fargo, and they're sitting at 196 sworn on the books, and they're going to, or 186, excuse me, going to 189 first of the year, and comparing their openings to, Chief Dossinger sitting here with our 44.5 right now, and percentage-wise, our community has a bigger gap than Fargo does. Sometimes people don't think about it in those terms either, but filling the positions and.
Yeah, and I think we have recent history where everybody knows it's slowed down out here, but crime never slows down. It changes, it evolves, right? We do a lot of stuff with opioids in DC, and we can call it whatever we want, but when we're dealing with addiction and those types of issues, I want it to be able to apply to whatever the drug of choice is going to be in 6 months, because it's not always going to be the same. But you talk about police reform. Fargo's a great example because they're on the border with Minnesota, and Minnesota passed all these touchy-feely police force laws, and now Cass County Sheriff they're not responding across the river because they want to, because of the different standards for use of force. And that's one thing, that's really a public safety issue and if something bad happens. But the biggest case I ever got in federal court was it was part of Operation Speed Racer, huge historical methamphetamine case, starting with the cartels in Mexico, running all the way through to Chicago, up through Seattle. But it wasn't busted by the feds. It was busted by a joint task force with DEA, Grand Forks, Polk County, and it was the local guys that ended up making the first crack in the case. So if you're not cooperating with people across the border, think of how many pounds of meth they got off the streets with that investigation that may have never happened under the current environment right now.
Yeah, and you probably could tie into a bunch of other experiences. From these criminal investigations, the ground level, local intelligence from the beginning, and the boots on the ground is where most of them start. And some people get caught up with the three initials, be it DEA, FBI, ATF, and some of our big,
They work best when they're listening to you all because you all know what's going on.
Yeah.
They can help you with undercover because everybody knows you.
Yeah. Qualified immunity we know is one of them. That's there that people are paying attention to. What about, training, some of these other ones?
Yeah, so, one, we talk about de-escalation training a lot, and very few people know what it actually means, right? And I give this example, and I'm going to pick on Sergeant Hannell. If Sergeant Hannell pulls over, or if Kylan Klauser pulls over Sergeant Hannell on the side of the road at 2:30 in the morning, and Sergeant Hannell decides, for those that don't know, Kylan's big, Mike's about my size. How Kylan would make sure and avoid any violent situation with Mike is very different than if Mike is pulling you over all alone on the side of a highway at 2:30 in the morning. Right. Use of force is not. It's not static. It depends on the size of the officer. It depends on the size of the person being pulled over. It depends on how long backup is away, how many people are around, all of these different things. And I think what everybody has to remember, and it doesn't matter if it's law enforcement or not, most violent acts happen in under 10 seconds. They happen in under 10 seconds. It's dark. Somebody's usually on something. And then, listen, I did this for 10 years. And then my job is to make that 10 seconds look as long as possible and act like everybody's waving the police fairy wand around and doing every normal, reasonable decision. You guys know this. A lot of what you do with training with handguns or whatever is how you control your heart rate. How you control, there's a reason you train and you train and you train and you train, because it has to work when your adrenaline spikes, not just when you're calm and in a sterile room. And we cannot make this some one-size-fits-all standard, because what will happen is officers will get hurt.
Some of the talk about these national training standards, do you see, is there any traction with this moving forward?
Well, I think the real traction will be insurance. Right? Okay. The real traction will be insurance. At some point in time, companies that insure law enforcement will require certain things, but I think that's a better version of that. If you want to have mental health training or de-escalation training and put it in place, my point is you can set some of those standards, particularly for grant money and those things, but you have to be able to do it in the framework that exists within state law enforcement. We use the post board for a lot of things. We do things differently. We can't send our guys to the FBI Academy every 3 months to do this training. We can't as a federal government force every different state and every different community to build up a training program based on some national standard. So if we are going to do some of those things, we have to incorporate how we already police our policers and allow our local and state organizations to do it under the framework they already have exist.
You've been in the criminal justice field for a long time, obviously through your law school experience and, knowing some of these officers growing up here in Dickinson and knowing the Dickinson Police Department. And some people, they'll talk about listen, rewind to your first memory of law enforcement, to what was, and then just the natural growth and progression that they've made on their own, and how much further and advanced we are, but there's this talk now that, there's a lot of voices out there saying, that it's not good enough, it's not far enough, we need to do more, which, but in hindsight, look at how far we are from where you began as a kid till now.
Yeah, but also look at how quick quick that pendulum has shifted back. I mean, we were from the defund the police, from Seattle to Minneapolis to New York City. I mean, look who won the mayor's election. It turns out people want to live in safe communities.
Sure.
Like, who knew?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think sometimes, and I think that's again where we go to, we were talking about it earlier with patriotism, but it's the instant, highly formulated news and information people are getting, right? Every time you click, I always tell people, but I think it swings back, right? I mean, we already know listen, the reason we've done good with addiction related reforms in North Dakota is because cops and prosecutors asked us to do it. It's not because old defense attorneys like me said, hey, we should treat addiction more like a disease. It's because you all got sick of using county and 3 days over a weekend as a substitute for somebody who you knew needed treatment and needed help. This has come from law enforcement. But I'm telling you, it doesn't matter if you're white, black, Asian, Hispanic, anywhere. When you live in a community and you're raising kids, you want good schools and you want safe communities. And no matter what political rhetoric exists out there, those two things are going to exist. I mean, I think the pendulum's already swung back.
Sure. No, we're blessed. We talk about it all the time. Mike, through our public information officer, we've been in a bubble here. Really, we've never felt what some of these other things I know you experienced in D.C. and through the Capitol riots and stuff like that. That you look at our Facebook page and we're showered with love. From
and I think the other answer is nobody hates a bad cop worse than a good cop. Like that really truly is. But a lot of the stuff on the use of force and putting civilians on or requiring civilian oversight, that's fine to a point. I mean, you can have a civilian member of an oversight board, but you can't have a full civilian member on or full civilian oversight board because they don't understand your training. They don't understand. I mean, listen, we have people say you should shoot people in the leg. This isn't James Bond for anybody who's watching here. And if you don't think so, like I always used to say, if you were going to do a shooting test for concealed weapons, right? They have you go out, they have you stand 15 feet away and shoot a watermelon, right? I mean, the shooting test is ridiculous. What they should do is they should let you go out for a nice dinner at the Brick House. You and your wife should have a bottle of wine. You should have a good night. You should go home. You should be in deep sleep at 3:30 in the morning, and your concealed weapons instructor should barge into your room, bang 3 pots over your head, make you run around your house 3 times, and then try and hit the watermelon. Right? If you're going to do it, that's how you should do this. That's how you should actually do the test. So you can't have civilian oversight without people properly trained in what you're supposed to be trained in. It's an unfair way to assess that situation. And even you all have been in jury trials where this comes up, and even when defense attorneys do that, I mean, that's what we try and do. We try and break it down and do all of those things, but the jury instructions are pretty quick, and prosecutors are really, really good at getting people back to where they need to be. So
let's maybe broaden the stroke a little bit. So, at the narrow end of it, just law enforcement and such, but criminal justice in a broader spectrum here. I know you've been heavily involved in some pieces of legislation that are hitting the floor, have hit the floor. Can you give us up-to-date, current day?
So I think the first one is, it's called the Equal Act. It's a crack parity and sentencing bill. And this is in federal court. Right. This is, enhancements for crack cocaine sentencing. And essentially it went from 100 to 1 to 13 to 1 for the First Step Act. But 1/13 of the amount of crack will get you, or 1/13 the amount of cocaine will get you the same sentence as crack. So, and you all know this. I mean, the vast majority, particularly of low-level drug offenses, are between the age of 18 and 23. And it's what I like about this bill is we're not excusing anything. We're just saying maybe a first-time federal offender at 20 years old shouldn't get 62 years in federal prison. And for those that don't know, in federal prison, if you get 62 years in prison, you serve 85% of it. There is no, like, life in federal court and federal prison means life. You don't ever get out. And so it's a disparity in sentencing. We've been working on getting that through. It passed Judiciary Committee with only 5 Republicans voting against it. And there's all kinds of other issues why that comes into play, in public defense in urban areas, and how they do in sentence enhancements in federal court. But what I like about it is anybody who gets convicted gets convicted. I mean, anybody who's charged is charged. Most of them already carry a 5 or a 10-year minimum mandatory sentence. So it's really the back end of the sentence. 8.5 years when you're 22 years old and it's your first offense is a lot. I mean, it's a lot. And so trying to do that. And then the next thing I'm working on, which maybe we can talk about a little bit, is geofence warrants.
Yeah,
and how we're dealing with that. And we just got a report out yesterday that Google had 20,000 geofence warrant requests from 2018 to 2020. And what a geofence warrant is essentially, I don't know how they're constitutional anyway. I just don't. General warrants per se are unconstitutional. Warrants have to be specific. You've all sworn to affidavits on a warrant. But a geofence warrant is asking for data in an area at a time. And that's what they're asking for. So if there was a break-in at, I don't know, Simonson's on Main Street, I stopped there on my way in, and and you all have no clues. You can request Google's information for within a quarter mile of Simonson between 1 a.m. and 1:20 a.m. And then you get that data, and they say there's protections in there, but if you can ever get to a name, then if you can get to one name, you can get to all the names. And I think just generally, this is the new conversation moving forward, because everything's going to wearables, right? I've got a Garmin watch on. Right now, it's only mostly Garmin and Google because their geolocation services are the best. But I will be the first one to concede, and facial recognition is going to be coming, and we're going to deal with it. I will be the first one to concede that there's an absolute public safety benefit to knowing who everybody is and where they're at all times. And we have that capability almost particularly right now. But we still have a Fourth Amendment. We still have issues with this. And I think how we deal with privacy in the digital age moving forward. Think about what we're doing with vehicles right now. And let's take it out of the criminal context. So let's just talk. Unfortunately, divorce is a part of everybody's life. Well, if the car is in the husband's name and it's a 2021 Toyota Tundra, and they're getting a divorce, and it's really the wife's car, but it's in the husband's name, think of all the data that exists in that Toyota. Whose data is it? Can you utilize that data in a criminal case? Can you use it in a civil case? Who has access to that? Can you subpoena it directly from the company if you're looking at somebody specific? Now, that wouldn't be a geofence question because you're actually trying to do that. So how we deal with this incredible technology moving forward, and our relationship both with private business, each other, and the government as far as privacy is concerned, I think is the next big conversation we are going to have. And this is an area where we won't always agree, but I think it's important that we're talking to the people that utilize it and use it, because everything's going to wearables, all of it. I mean, some of the things we've learned, do you think you turn your phone off or put it on airplane mode? You think you put it in one of those little gray boxes? Well, as soon as you turn it back on, all that information uploads again anyway. So
we have a local story that's real close to what compares to what you just talked about there. And it was a burglary in town, right? And I think we've talked some about the vague details of this maybe in a past conversation, but we did a Google geofence warrant as part of it. And we got charged for it. I don't know what the charge was on it, but we get charged for it. But we end up getting the details back, and it was a burglary that was committed between the hours of, let's say, 3 and 5 in the morning. And we put the four corners directly over the building just to see, hey, we knew the entry had been made. And we did. We obtained 4 names out of that during that course of time to be able to sort through. And so the investigation is still pending now. Yeah. But
well, and by the way, I want to be clear. I don't begrudge any law enforcement. The best law enforcement officers I've ever met and ever dealt with are going to use whatever the tools that are available to them. It's our job to put the guardrails on. And even if we don't always agree on the guardrails, it's our job to put the guardrails on. And these conversations are going to get more interesting as we continue to move forward, because there's just so much information. And there's also a difference between an investigative stop and a community caretaker, right? If we're trying to find a lost 16-year-old girl, and we think she's possibly abducted, or it's 30 below and just nobody's seen her, or any of those types of things. Using that technology to your advantage in those situations is different than how broad a geofence warrant is. And we look at it, this is also one of those areas where you look at it. It's one thing if you're doing it to I use the Four Corners Diner, if you do it right over the four corners of that at 2:30 in the morning, you're probably only going to get one name if it was broke into. But if you're doing this over a diner in New York City at 2:30 in the morning, you're going to have 1,500 people that pop on that thing. And that's where we have to really talk about. The one out of the 1,500 that is actually guilty of it is one thing, but there's 1,400 other people who have no reason to be a part of a government warrant whatsoever. No reason. They're just walking down the sidewalk. And that's a scary place for an old criminal defense attorney to look.
How do you see this playing out? As it moves forward, wind's not the best word for it, but as this thing progresses, and how do you see it in your head?
Well, for geofence, we'll see how it works. There's a case pending in New York, and I think they'll be fine. Listen, trying to react to how some of this works is going to be interesting. But the U.S. Supreme Court got U.S. v. Car. They've proven that they're going to look at different things like third-party carrier and stuff differently in a digital age, right? Like using a cell tower to track somebody, so you don't have to originally get the warrant on them was allowed, now isn't allowed anymore. And so I don't know how it comes, but we'll be working on a bill to significantly put serious guardrails on how geofence warrants are used for investigative purposes.
Talk about decriminalization. This is trying to keep stuff checked off the list here I got in front of me here. I know that, Oregon, not necessarily a great example for us here in North Dakota to use a lot of comparisons to, but big decriminalization act comes through with a lot of their illegal drugs and different stuff that, and so, are you familiar with that? So Oregon's law is crazy. Yeah.
It's hallucinogens, it's all kinds of different issues, and they want to try it. Whatever. There's marijuana and there's everything else, right? There's marijuana and there's everything else. Regardless of how you feel about marijuana law, I think we can all agree it shouldn't be a Schedule I narcotic at the federal level. For those that don't know, Schedule I is no medical purpose whatsoever. 2, 3, 4, even like amphetamines aren't a Schedule I because they have a medical purpose. Opioids aren't a Schedule I because they have a medical purpose. The problem is you can't move marijuana into a different schedule because there's no validated. Medical marijuana is passed in every state in a lot of states across the country, but until you get more data and more research, it's very difficult to move it into a pharmaceutical grade. What we can't continue to do is what I call ostriching. It's a Schedule I federal narcotic on par with cocaine, and we allow states to regulate it and legalize it. Well, that's the only place we allow that to happen anywhere. Right. And it's bad public policy. So last year we had what was called the States Act, which basically took primacy as relating to marijuana law and flipped it. Instead of the federal government having primacy, state governments had primacy. And all that, that probably wasn't a perfect solution, but at least the law would have reflected what we're doing from one end of the country to the other. So I think my answer with, decriminalization and legalization are kind of where they are everywhere else. Decide it locally. Let local states, we passed medical marijuana in North Dakota. I would recommend not doing those things on constitutional ballot measures. One of the things the party that did was forgot to decriminalize the sale. I was one of the guys saying, listen, just put it into the law as it is. I'm not a huge fan of constitutional ballot measures because they're usually written terribly. I'm like, just put it into law. And they're like, why? I go, because nobody will do medical marijuana in North Dakota. And they're like, why? Because you didn't decriminalize the sale. I don't think anybody's going to give it away for free. So dealing with those issues, but I think really taking it forward and listen, I don't want my kids smoking marijuana, and I don't want to live in a community where you walk around the street and you can smell it everywhere. But at the same time, I think when we're dealing with a lot of the different issues that we're dealing with, I would prefer law enforcement's resources weren't dealing with a couple kids who came back from Boulder skiing over Christmas break and weighing the jar that the marijuana's in and counting that to the total weight to get it up above a felony, which are things we've seen happen before too. So
You know, and when you start talking about substance abuse, you can't negate mental health and stuff like that.
Chicken or the egg. I mean, they both exist, right?
And I know you were a big part of that at the state level as when you were working in your capacity here and trying to do some things for Western North Dakota. And I know Chief Dawson is trying to lead the charge with some committees and stuff for us to try to figure this out, you know, whatever that means. But
the first problem is we don't have enough people in school right now to fill the mental health positions that are open from one end of the country to the other. They're not in school right now. So the policies we do have to deal with the services we have and not the services we wish we had. And I think free through recovery and some of the things they've done at the state have been, I mean, they've moved faster, and we're going to have growing pains. The other problem with mental health and addiction when it comes to what you all do every day is, listen, regardless of how you feel about prison sentences and jail sentences, it's 4 cinder block walls and bars on the window, right? There's a very defined metric of a prison sentence. If you bust these people and you send them, when you're dealing with addiction and relapse and treating it through a diversion program instead of a prison sentence, how do you define wins and losses, right? If you have 100 people addicted to meth, they're all under the age of 24, they're all first offenses, and you divert all 100 of them. You and I, we all know there's relapse, and not just relapse from addiction. There'll be relapse for criminal justice. And so they're going to have all of that. So how you define whether you are actually doing a better job. But the ROI on getting somebody sober is significantly better than putting them in there, because the crime's hereditary too, and addiction's hereditary too. And if you can break that cycle of addiction in a family, now you didn't just do it with dad or mom, but you gave that kid at home an exponentially better chance to succeed. And what we're doing isn't working. We know that, but we have to be able to deal with it. And I also think, you guys have been doing this longer than I have. I think this has moved faster than most people would think. But even in your field, people are much more interested in discussing it and figuring out, particularly on nonviolent crimes. Now, you and I have the same take on nonviolent crimes. We call way too many things nonviolent crime. Our victimless crimes. Tell that to a pharmacy owner who has to throw out every single jar on his or her shelves because somebody broke in to steal something. Those aren't victimless crimes. People get cost a lot of money. Society gets cost a lot of money. But also at the same time, we have to do a better job at treating addiction-related crimes. Because if you sit in prison for 3 years, you know what you learn? How to be a better criminal. I mean, we have good programs in prison in doing that, but I mean, the reality is if we can keep you out, keep you employed, keep you sober, that's what we're really looking for.
As it goes to your connections here with Western North Dakota, is there anything statewide that, Intimate with specifically they're trying to do with the current programs, and anything that could benefit us here out west?
Well, I mean, we don't have beds. That's a problem. But I think the best thing, it's one of the few bright spots from COVID, telehealth. Being able to deal with telehealth. We worked actually on addiction or medical-based treatment with opioids. We got actually one of the reasons you couldn't do that for telehealth is because the drugs prescribed to treat it are DEA controlled. So you couldn't prescribe them over telehealth. And so we worked, David Trone, he's a congressman from Maryland, he's a Democrat. We run kind of the bipartisan working group on addiction policy. And so we got DEA to back off of that. But I think telehealth is going to allow us to do more of that. Now, when you deal with what we deal with, right, when we were dealing with involuntary commitments and those types of things, that only works so far as if you can get consent to do those types of things. But I think one of the things I try and explain to a lot of people is the hidden costs of mental health. Right? If you're in Hettinger or Adams County and you have a female mental health call at 2:30 in the morning, they will not transport that patient without a female officer. So you have to find a female officer, and depending on what county it is in Western North Dakota, we still don't have as many. Right. You got to drive them. Oftentimes you can't go to Jamestown or you can't go to Bismarck because they're full. So you drive to Jamestown and back. Well, that's not covered in any kind of mental health breakdown. That's in the overtime budget of the Adams County Sheriff's Office, right? That's where that is. And then you got to bring them back for a hearing because they have to have a hearing within 48 hours. And you asked me to do it as, public defense. And they're like, well, will you waive the hearing? And I'm like, well, I can't waive the hearing. I've never met my client. I mean, how do you waive a mental health hearing when you can't talk to somebody in person? So that's where the telehealth and some of those things really are going to be able to come into play. And we're going to have to utilize those resources because we just don't have them.
Yeah, and baby steps. I mean, 211
Yeah, I think one thing in southwestern North Dakota, we're really limited as far as the resources that we have. And I think Congressman brought up a really good point. As you know, the mental health related issues and drug related issues is a large percentage of what we do on a monthly basis as far as for our calls for service. And it even seems, say during the COVID era, since the COVID really hit us, we're dealing with more mental health related issues than we ever have.
And I don't think we've seen the full consequences of those yet.
I agree.
I mean, 14-year-old kids, 7-year-old kids, I think we're going to be dealing with these lockdowns and what has happened for a long time.
And a lot of our resources are tied up. And, in Western North Dakota, people with mental health related issues, they don't deserve to be held at the Southwest Multi-County Correctional Center. That's not a spot for them. And that's something that we continue to beat our drum, is trying to develop more resources in Western North Dakota to help that. What do you see on the federal side? Are we on the radar with some of the programs?
So yes, and as far as and one of the things I do in all of this is two things. I make sure that there's the correct proportional amount of money for rural communities and tribal communities. And those are both very important to me, because tribes have all the same problems we have rural, except usually they're even more rural, but they also have a different acute set of federal, state restrictions that exist. But the problem again is we can build the nicest mental health facility on the planet somewhere in Dickinson, and if we don't have people to work there and we can't staff it, none of those things, none of that works. And I think sometimes, and this is where I think sometimes we throw, particularly federally, we throw too much money at a problem, but we also make that money so restrictive. That's how local people don't get the money. You could apply for everything for the grant, but all of a sudden you have to have 5 social workers on staff full time. Well, good luck. We do peer-to-peer counseling. We do imperfect solutions because we have what's available to us. So we try and make that money as flexible as possible. And that's what I mean by saying being able to treat this stuff with the services we have, not the services we wish we had. And then the other issue we have to deal with, and this is a much harder conversation because it's private sector essentially, is how hospitals are insured on crisis beds. And one of the reasons you see hospitals get away from crisis beds isn't because they don't want to help people. It's insurance. It's how they get, it's how they deal with those things. How we've delivered overall medical care has changed so much in the last 20 years. But the one thing we all know is if you have somebody experience acute addiction and mental health problems, they can't wait 18 days for an appointment. They just can't. They have to have that appointment within the next 12 hours. Anybody who's ever dealt with a family member in an intervention type scenario knows if you don't get it handled, it goes away and you have to do it again. And we talk a lot about opioids. We talk a lot about different drugs, but alcohol is still the number one drug we have to deal with. We just treat it differently as a country. But if you don't have those abilities to react quickly, then all the work in the world you're doing isn't really helping.
Some of the good, I think, on the local level recently is that 211 I mentioned here a little bit ago. Still, so the state now, Kelly, as it's got it, we have this resource, or officers are out there, and when they're coming in contact, and let's use your example out here in Adams County or in a rural area, they got a 211 option. They can get somebody on the phone, a mental health professional. Now we both know that is not. We just got done talking with thumbs and electronic community. It's not face to face, but and there certainly has been losses when that has been used by our officers, but there has been some wins too. But I kind of like it. Our officers are using it more and more for tracking. We can start to get some idea. Your things won't have a better shot at not getting lost in the mix from our response to actual mental health person. And then, you use that 211, it's got a tracking system of sorts. Well,
and we have a unique ability and a unique opportunity in Southwest North Dakota because we have the women's prison. And it's there that whether it's through technology or different areas, we should be able to bring, and we should have been doing this longer and more before. When we had the fight about potentially moving the women's prison, one of the answers was because there were no services out here. Well, my answer is, why don't we bring the services out here instead of move the prison somewhere else, right? We can have that conversation for however we want, but we do have the unique ability as we continue to deal with how we deal with these issues that we have a facility here that is going to force change, I think. Because my guess is if there's any in the women's prison right now, probably only one is a violent crime. The rest of them are mostly probably revocations of our underlying nonviolent crimes.
Does when we're talking shortages in the mental health profession, at the state level, some of these public jobs, and we're talking
it's national.
national. I mean, what are those conversations like as far as attributing? I mean, issues. Where are these people at? We know the people are here. We got bodies. So,
well, one of the things is it's just, I mean, you know, not a lot of people going into the field, and it's tough work. I mean, we've all known social workers that have burned out. We know cops that have burned out. It's really tough work. But two, this is where I disagree with some of my colleagues. I mean, I think if we have that problem in North Dakota, we have the ability to offer student loan repayments, do those types of things in North Dakota. I don't think we should scale those up to the national level for two reasons. One, I don't think it's a good idea just in general, because those programs always get bigger and they always incorporate more fields, and they always do that. Two, this is just me being from North Dakota. If you scale it up at the national level and you have shortages all over the country, how do we get our people here? I love Watford City, but I don't think if you're from Newark, you circle Watford City on a map and say, that's where I want to live. So, I mean, we have the ability to do programs. I think student loan repayments are probably the best way to do that. Now, the other thing we always have to do is recruit local high schools, different areas. I told the substance abuse place in Fargo when I met with them the other day. They're like, what's the one thing we could do? I said, you should start participating in job fairs at high schools. I go, because people don't know. I mean, first of all, you're getting 17-year-old guys and girls when they're at their most idealistic age, right? Which is what we always appreciate about the young. I mean, you can get them into a profession where by the time, even as a junior in college, they may be a little more cynical in those types of areas. But also for us, it's the single best predicator of whether you hire a nurse and he or she will still be here in 10 years is where were they born, right? If you're bringing, I mean, Border Patrol is a perfect example. When we bring in Border Patrol, because the training's in New Mexico, if we bring in a bunch of people from the southwest part of the United States to work at Pembina, as soon as they can transfer, they transfer. But if we bring them in and they're from, Botno, they'll be there forever. So we can do this locally too. We have great kids in Western North Dakota that care about their communities, and it's as rewarding these people save people's lives. How much more rewarding can you get than that?
Yeah, probably something that's just not highlighted enough. I mean,
and we need to pay them better.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the other answer. And I think this is a perfect example of when you don't have enough, it's actually worse, because then the people who are doing it burn out. So when you have too many empty seats, you end up having way too many empty seats real quick.
Yeah, creativity. Lieutenant Hanel in the room here talking about our marketing PIO stuff here. I mean, all the focus that we have to try to touch some of the young lives at the university here for Dickinson State University, the criminal justice program, which has been kind of a win for us. And then Chief Dossinger, we've got heading up where we have a program now going into the high school, and it piggybacks off what you said there on targeting these young local kids. Now,
one of the things we can do at the federal government is lower some of the restrictions on like teenage internships and things like that. Allow them to come. We notice it mostly in the construction field, or we have a shortage of truck drivers all over the country. Well, if you can't get insured till you're 25, by the time you're 25, being a truck driver doesn't look like the world's greatest job. But if you could start when you're 18, I mean, think about what you make as a truck driver in Western North Dakota in 2015. If you could get insured. But again, you're dealing with insurance then, right? And that's one of the issues we have to deal with, allowing people to get more active at an earlier age.
I think the other challenge at the state level is from hearing a lot of stories about the difficulty as far as getting licensed as a mental health professional in the state of North Dakota is very, very rigorous and strict. And a lot of times we have professionals from out of state that want to move here. So
we've done a couple things. Scott Meyer is a senator from Grand Forks and did it with the Air Force Base, allowed for reciprocity of licensing for anybody who was a spouse of anybody on the military. And you're right. And when we got into the legislature, our white picket fences, we've done a really good job in North Dakota of creating those. And they've started significantly. We did it with nurse practitioners, right? And we had to because of the oil boom and an oil patch, and we'd do those things. So the crisis has started bringing them back, but we need to do it more. That's the other area where telehealth is going to help, because if the only substance abuse person you can get on the phone is in Chicago, we're going to get them on the phone. And we've shown that we can do this, and the healthcare system as we know it doesn't come crashing down. But you're right, and we have to do it quicker, Chief.
Well, I know we got limited time with you, Kelly, and we got a few things here to talk about before a fun little round of speed cuffing at the end, which we'll get you some directions on once we get closer to that point. But maybe, I know that this is going to be a popular one for us. It's going to be a shared one. What are some things here you're working on moving forward that you could maybe just, with an open mic talk about, people are going to want to hear what you got to say.
Yeah, so I was on Judiciary and Oversight last Congress. Now I'm on Energy and Commerce. So we're always working on protecting North Dakota industry, North Dakota oil, North Dakota agriculture, the two industries that are number one and two in our state. And it really is a conversation about small family farms and onshore smaller oil and gas producers, right? Everybody in the ag industry and everybody in the energy industry is my friend. I'm from North Dakota, but whether it's whether it's Tyson Foods or Continental or ConocoPhillips, I mean, they can handle themselves. I'm more worried about the family farm and the oil field service shop in Western North Dakota and how we continue to allow North Dakota to do what it does best, and that's feed and fuel the world. And that's, policy at the single biggest threat we have to our way of life, particularly in the ag and the energy sector in North Dakota, is not weather, it's not drought, even though this year drought is real bad. The single biggest threat we have is federal regulation. And that is just the truth. There are too many people in D.C. who don't like what we do here. They don't like what we produce. They don't like how we recreate. They don't understand it. They've never had dirt under their fingernails a day in their life. So we produce things that are going to allow North Dakota Energy and North Dakota Ag to continue to produce for the next generation. And then I am the lead on we have what's called a big tech task force, and it's important because these are, with the exception of the East Indian Trading Company, the four most powerful companies in the history of the world all exist right now. And that doesn't make them all bad. It doesn't. Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, they have tremendously changed all of our lives and are going to continue to do that. But what they do is, and this is the part I'm on the anti-competition task force. What they are capable of doing is stifling out all competition and making it harder and harder for other industry to compete in those places. And it doesn't matter if you're a musician who wrote a song and you're not getting paid because the new digital format, nobody thinks they have to pay you royalties, or if you made a movie and it's getting pirated, or if you're the Dickinson Press or the Fargo Forum and 90% of your articles get read online and the advertising dollars for that reading don't go to the Dickinson Press or the Fargo Forum, they go to Google or Facebook. And so we will be actively engaged in that. I've said this all the time, I mean it. No matter how big Facebook gets, they're never going to cover the Dickinson Rough Riders. So I really do support local news. I want to know how the Rough Riders are doing. I want to know how all of those things are doing. And I think it's a really important question. And any brick and mortar store, whether it's in Dickinson or whether it's in Detroit, is going to have to participate in e-commerce to survive in the 21st century. And right now, e-commerce runs through particularly one company, and they have what are called contracts of adhesion, and I'm not okay with it.
Chief, do you got anything while we have him teed up here?
I just certainly want to thank you for taking the time today to come and spend with us and answer some really tough questions. And as you know, the law enforcement profession, even though we're located in southwestern North Dakota, we've got some big hurdles ahead of us, a lot of related issues.
Yeah, and what I'm really concerned about, particularly in the law enforcement, and I don't know how you quantify this, is with the narrative that, like I said, I think the pendulum's already swinging back, but as horrible as the rhetoric has been towards your field nationally over the last 18 months, I wonder how it's going to be recruiting more young people to get into that field. And you're right. In Dickinson, Bismarck, North Dakota, we have tremendous support for our law enforcement agencies, and we have been in a little bit in a bubble. But you don't recruit just from Dickinson and Bismarck and everywhere else. And I'm really worried about what the future of law enforcement looks like because, when I was a kid, everybody wanted to be an astronaut or a police officer. I'm sure they still want to be astronauts, but I'm not sure that's the same case after the last 18 months. And that's what's damaging and dangerous about a lot of the rhetoric coming out of DC.
Yeah, one of the recent polls that came out on Police One, and there was, I think, about 5,000 that came on the sample, but it was a little bit alarming to see as many of your tenured officers had talked about not recommending their children and young people to enter the profession. And so there were some other questions that softened that blow a little bit, but yeah, it's where you're saying, and I think one of the things I see a little bit up at the university with some of the college kids is, you know, you and I being a kid, and I know Chief Dossinger and Lieutenant Hannell being a kid, like the SWAT operators and the high adrenaline stuff like that. Surprisingly, a lot of the young men and women now, they have different things that they want to see on the marketing end of it. You know, be it with the fingers, the computers, the technology, and you know, out into the community, some pictures and stuff like that, which is a good thing. I mean, but it's different, and it's forcing us to work a little bit here and being creative with luring them in.
Yeah, it's you know, that's the one thing I think that's really been great that I've always loved about Western North Dakota in particular. It is the protect and serve, right? It's always been that. And whether you talked about the Bachran barbecue and participating in those things, and that was, so I'll tell you from somebody who used to do that stuff and got to come back and be a part of it. It's great on both ends. The community's obviously out there to support you all. I mean, that's why it was there. It was huge. Everybody's ready to get out of the house. We know that. But you were all there participating actively in the event. I mean, there weren't a lot of eye rolls and, oh, I got to go do this thing when I'd rather do that. I mean, I think that is the part about being in Western North Dakota that we sometimes forget how lucky we are, and that you guys are supported so well from the community, but you also do so much to support the community. And I don't just mean pulling over a drunk driver at 1:30 in the morning. I mean participating in those things, the blood battles and all the different events that we do and that you all do to make sure that people know you, not just when they're speeding.
And we have about 70 staff in the building, right, Chief?
Yeah, you know, pretty close. We got 44 and a half sworn members, and then non-sworn staff. We're about 70 right now.
I mean, you were coaching Mustang. I mean, we've got people participating. You know, that's the one thing I will tell you both. And this is a very uniquely North Dakota story. I've had the privilege and the unfortunate privilege of being able to participate in 2 officers' funerals already since I've been in Congress, and just the strength of the community and the strength of the police community all across the state participated in both of them in a meaningful way, but in the community and how that goes. And I just tell anybody who's ever, I mean, unfortunately these things happen, and pay attention to how they happen, and pay attention to how other law enforcement agencies rally around each other, and then pay attention to how the community rallies around them as well.
I know there was some good messaging on your part in those instances that did come back across the state from Grand Forks and Cody Holte's funeral and stuff, that the profession was very appreciative of on that end too, Kel. So, I think it's going to be a lot of stuff here our listeners are going to be able to tune into, and they're going to love hearing from you, Kel. At the beginning of it, talking about your favorite jobs being, you know, Mustang and Rough Rider baseball, and all the way through to being back here with us in the Public Safety Center now.
You miss coaching? I miss it.
So I miss coaching. The worst job I ever had was being the volunteer president of the baseball club for 10 years. I miss coaching a lot. I don't necessarily miss that side of it, but that's not true, right? We have the big sticks here now. We have one of the nicest fields in the entire Midwest region. You know, I give all kinds of credit to Dan Kovash and Craig Steve and all of these guys, Doug Frenzel and all of the people, but we all built that. You know, we went and raised the money for it. We did it. It's a big reason why we have the ability to do that. Now, my friend Dave Aulette's running it, and, you know, we hosted regional tournaments. We have a great Mustang facility. We need more fields, but it sounds like that's coming now, too. I just really, there's not many things on the earth that is better than having a taco in a bag at a Midwestern nice baseball field that is more of a Midwestern American Legion, rural Central America thing. And you can do it in Billings, you can do it in Rapid City, but we have as nice a fields as anywhere in the country right here.
Our Dickinson High School softball team just wins the state championship.
I was there.
Goes viral on the floor, forfeited couple-minute time,
Yeah.
giving some stats out, throwing some light their direction on that. So, and I just say that because I know it ties into.
But you know what's really cool about that? That's the most engagement I've ever had in my official capacity. You know, we talk about how mean everything is, but and that just proves to me people respond to good things. Like, that was just fun. I mean, how can you not, like, first of all, if you're a ball and bat sport person, that was the most dominating performance I've ever seen. You know, usually when you 10 run a team, it's because there's walks and errors and somebody's just completely outclassing them. Well, Bismarck High had beat them taken them to extra innings about 12 days earlier. And the DHS softball team just walked out. I mean, it was like, we're winning this game and we're going to do everything absolutely right. But that was the most activity and most engagement I've got on my Facebook page since I've been in Congress, which means people care about good stories. You know, I always used to tell, I think I've said this before, but whenever you wake up and you're in a grind and you got it didn't matter if it was a criminal defense lawyer in Congress, I always read the sports page first. And the sports, because that's always usually celebrating somebody's accomplishments. The front page is usually telling you everything that's wrong in the world or in your community. But at least in the sports page, you get to read like positive stories about people.
You know, I think that's one good thing about living in Dickinson is even though going through the COVID stuff and it's starting to spike again a little bit, but the positiveness that, you know, we have a lot of positive things going on in our community, the downtown square project, the sports complex, the expansion of our library downtown, and kind of a new project for us coming up is the Public Safety Training Center. You know, there's a lot of good things going on in our community right now. That's because people aren't afraid to volunteer their time.
Yeah.
And work towards projects. And I don't know if that's in a lot of communities if that happens.
They're engaged. Yeah, they're engaged.
It's why we handled coming through the boom as well as anybody. It's why we handled the last bus, the first bus I grew up in, better than most people. I mean, we've got corner businesses that have been active participants in our community that have always existed here. And I mean, we're really, really lucky here.
That's pretty good stuff, Kelly. And that's going to be a perfect time to kick it over into Speedcuffing. And so you hear the noise right there. And so you know how Speedcuffing is in the tactical sense, Kelly, criminal defense attorney. And so the rules are you're going to have 30 seconds.
Do you still use cuffs or do you use zip ties now?
Yeah, cuffs.
Okay,
Cuffs still.
just checking.
Yeah, we have them available, but primarily our cuffs. So 30 seconds, you're going to get through as many of these as possible. If nothing comes to mind for it, you can pass and we can come back to it later.
Okay.
So having fun with it. So you betcha. Ready to go, Lieutenant Hannell? All right. Favorite sports team?
Dickinson Rough Riders.
Federal, state, or municipal government?
State.
Favorite type of hunt?
Whitetail.
Baseball or softball?
Both.
A day in D.C. or a day in Dickinson?
Dickinson.
How many members of the U.S. House have led to be president?
No idea.
First Speaker of the House was?
No idea.
First designated Republican floor leader in 1897 from Minnesota was?
No idea.
Love it. So that's good.
Those are some tough ones.
Yeah, I had to throw. I know what kind of brain he's got. So
Pheasant hunting with my buddies might be better than whitetail hunting, but we'll go with whitetail hunting.
Yeah, well, Kelly operates at a high level, so I wasn't going to give him a bunch of freebies the entire time. I had to at least make myself feel competent. So, that was a little over an hour and just nothing. I'd like to spend the next 2-3 hours, as would Lieutenant Hannell and Chief Dossinger, Kelly. But we know you got appointments to get to, and you're a busy man, full day ahead of you. So,
well, I appreciate you having me on. It's great to see you all. We started this. We walked in, and you were talking about all the training that was going on in the building today. And I tell you, when I used to practice criminal defense, and you fly on an airplane, sometimes you get that chatty person next to you, and they always ask what you do for a living. And sometimes sometimes you just want to say criminal defense. I don't feel like having the conversation with a stranger about how can you represent people, blah blah blah. So I always used to say I train police officers.
kind of like that. It's kind of like that.
You do the physical training. I did the cross-examine training.
Yes. A lot of good stories there. Over a beer next time. So, thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.
All our listeners, make sure to listen to the podcast. You can subscribe, Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music. Make sure to like the YouTube channel. Facebook page is a real popular one for us. So, we will be back, episode 5, next time around. Thanks, guys.